For thousands of years, humans dreamed of flying. Ancient civilizations imagined gods with wings, mythical creatures soaring through the skies, and heroes lifted into the air by divine power. Long before science offered answers, flight represented freedom, transcendence, and mastery over nature. During the 19th century, this dream slowly began to move from myth to engineering. Advances in physics, mechanics, and materials created the first real possibility that controlled, powered flight could become a reality. Inventors across Europe and the United States began experimenting with gliders, propulsion systems, and control mechanisms. Many of these early attempts failed. Some ended in public embarrassment. Others ended in serious injury or death. What all of them shared was a fundamental misunderstanding of what truly mattered in flight. Most inventors focused on engines and lift, believing that power alone would conquer the air. Very few understood that control was the real problem. Into this world were born two brothers who would quietly solve the puzzle that defeated everyone else. Wilbur Wright was born in 1867. Orville Wright followed 4 years later, in 1871. They grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a modest but intellectually rich household. Their father, Milton Wright, was a bishop who valued education, debate, and independent thinking. Their mother, Susan Wright, had a strong mechanical intuition and encouraged curiosity. As children, the Wright brothers were fascinated by machines. One of the most important moments of their childhood came when their father brought home a small toy helicopter powered by twisted rubber bands. The simple device flew briefly, then fell to the ground, but it left a permanent impression. The idea that something heavier than air could lift itself stayed with them for life. Unlike many inventors of their time, the Wright brothers never attended university. Instead, they educated themselves. They read constantly, studied mathematics, physics, and engineering principles, and learned through experimentation. Their lack of formal credentials would later be used against them, but it also freed them from conventional thinking. In the 1890s, bicycles became extremely popular in the United States. The Wright brothers opened a bicycle shop in Dayton, repairing and eventually manufacturing bicycles of their own design. This business provided them with income, mechanical experience, and something even more valuable, an understanding of balance and control. A bicycle remains upright not because it is powerful, but because it is controlled. Steering, balance, and continuous adjustment keep it stable. This insight would later become central to their approach to flight. At the same time, the world was captivated by stories of aviation pioneers. One of the most influential figures was Otto Lilienthal, a German engineer who conducted hundreds of glider flights in the 1890s. Lilienthal carefully documented his experiments and shared his findings publicly. His work inspired inventors around the world, including the Wright brothers. In 1896, Lilienthal died in a gliding accident. His last reported words were, "Sacrifices must be made." The tragedy deeply affected Wilbur Wright. Instead of discouraging him, it reinforced the seriousness of the challenge. Flight was possible, but it demanded precision, humility, and respect for physics. The Wright brothers began studying everything they could find about aviation. They read books, academic papers, and reports from previous experiments. However, they soon noticed a troubling pattern. Much of the existing data was contradictory or incomplete. Lift calculations did not match real-world results. Stability assumptions failed in practice. Rather than accepting this information blindly, the Wright brothers questioned it. They realized that if existing data was unreliable, they would need to generate their own. This decision marked a turning point. Instead of copying designs from others, they committed to understanding the fundamentals of flight from the ground up. In 1899, Wilbur Wright wrote a letter to the Smithsonian Institution requesting information on aeronautical research. This letter is often considered the true beginning of their journey toward powered flight. It was not a declaration of ambition, but a request for knowledge. Their early experiments focused on gliders. They chose Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, as their testing location because of its strong, consistent winds and soft sandy ground. The remote environment also offered privacy. Unlike many inventors who sought publicity, the Wright brothers preferred secrecy. Between 1900 and 1902, they built and tested multiple gliders. Each version taught them something new. Many early flights were unstable and difficult to control. Pilots often lost balance or crashed after short distances. The breakthrough came when the brothers applied a concept inspired by birds. They observed that birds changed the shape of their wings to maintain balance. The Wright brothers developed a system called wing warping, which allowed the pilot to twist the wings slightly to control roll. This innovation solved one of aviation's greatest challenges, lateral control. For the first time, a pilot could actively steer an aircraft in 3 dimensions. Combined with a movable rudder and elevator, this created what is now known as 3-axis control, the foundation of all modern airplanes. By 1902, the Wright brothers had built a glider that could be controlled reliably. This achievement alone placed them ahead of nearly every other aviation experimenter in the world. Yet, few people noticed. There were no major headlines. No public demonstrations. The brothers were not interested in fame. They were interested in solving the problem completely. The next challenge was power. A glider could prove control, but true flight required an engine that was both light and strong. Existing engines were too heavy. Instead of waiting for someone else to solve this problem, the Wright brothers designed their own engine with the help of their mechanic, Charlie Taylor. The engine they built was simple, but it worked. It produced enough power to drive 2 propellers through a chain system. The propellers themselves were another innovation. While others treated propellers as modified fans, the Wright brothers understood them as rotating wings. This insight dramatically improved efficiency. By late 1903, everything was ready. On December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers achieved what many believed was impossible. Near Kitty Hawk, Orville Wright piloted a powered, heavier-than-air aircraft that took off under its own power, flew in a controlled manner, and landed safely. The first flight lasted only 12 seconds and covered 120 feet. 3 more flights followed that day, with the longest lasting 59 seconds. This moment is widely recognized today as the birth of powered aviation. However, at the time, almost no one believed it. The Wright brothers returned to Dayton quietly. They did not immediately seek publicity. Instead, they focused on refining their design and protecting their invention. They understood that aviation would have enormous commercial and military value. This understanding led them into a new battlefield, patents. And that battlefield would nearly erase them from history. After their successful flights in 1903, the Wright brothers understood something that many inventors before them had failed to grasp. The airplane was not just a scientific curiosity. It was a revolutionary technology with enormous commercial and military potential. Whoever controlled the rights to this invention would shape the future of aviation. Rather than immediately demonstrating their aircraft publicly, the Wright brothers made a deliberate decision to focus on legal protection. In March 1903, even before their first powered flight, they had filed a patent application. This patent did not focus on the engine or the airframe. Instead, it focused on the true breakthrough, the system of 3-axis control. This decision would later become the foundation of one of the most aggressive and controversial patent defenses in technological history. The Wright patent, granted in 1906, covered the method of controlling an aircraft by adjusting the wings and rudder to maintain lateral balance. Although the patent described wing warping specifically, its language was broad enough to include any system that achieved the same result, even if the mechanical method was different. At the time, few people understood the significance of this patent. Aviation was still seen by many as a novelty. Governments were skeptical. Scientific institutions were cautious. Newspapers often dismissed reports of powered flight as exaggerations or hoaxes. The Wright brothers struggled to convince others that their invention was real. When they approached the United States government and military officials, they were met with hesitation. Officials demanded public demonstrations before committing to any contracts. The Wright brothers refused, fearing that public exposure would allow competitors to copy their design before proper agreements were in place. This standoff slowed their progress. Meanwhile, inventors in Europe began experimenting with powered flight more openly. In France, aviation became a public spectacle. Demonstrations attracted large crowds and media attention. Pilots like Alberto Santos Dumont gained fame for short but visible flights. Ironically, many of these early European flights lacked the level of control achieved by the Wright brothers. They relied heavily on stability and short bursts of power rather than precise maneuvering. However, public perception favored what could be seen. By 1908, the Wright brothers realized that secrecy was hurting them. They began public demonstrations in both the United States and Europe. These demonstrations were stunning. Wilbur Wright's flights in France proved beyond doubt that controlled, sustained flight was possible. He executed smooth turns, figure-8 patterns, and extended flights that left audiences amazed. Suddenly, the Wright brothers were recognized as the true inventors of the airplane. But recognition came with new problems. As aviation interest exploded, dozens of inventors and companies began developing their own aircraft. Many of them used control systems that achieved the same functional result as the Wright design, even if the mechanical details differed. This included the use of ailerons, small hinged surfaces on the wings that provided lateral control. The Wright brothers viewed these systems as direct infringements of their patent. One of the most significant figures to emerge during this period was Glenn Curtiss. Curtiss was a talented engineer, motorcycle racer, and engine designer. He quickly became one of the most influential aviation pioneers in the United States. Unlike the Wright brothers, Curtiss embraced public exhibitions and rapid experimentation. Curtiss adopted ailerons instead of wing warping. He argued that ailerons were fundamentally different and did not violate the Wright patent. The Wright brothers strongly disagreed. They believed that any system providing lateral control through differential lift fell under their patent. This disagreement escalated into a legal war. Beginning in 1909, the Wright brothers filed multiple lawsuits against Curtiss and other aviation pioneers. These cases dragged on for years. Courtrooms became battlegrounds where technical diagrams, expert testimony, and legal interpretations clashed. The Wright brothers won most of these cases. Courts repeatedly ruled that the Wright patent was valid and that aileron-based control systems infringed upon it. These victories gave the Wrights legal authority over nearly all practical airplane designs in the United States. However, winning in court came at a cost. Many critics accused the Wright brothers of stifling innovation. While European aviation advanced rapidly through open experimentation, American aviation slowed under the weight of litigation. Inventors hesitated to build aircraft, fearing lawsuits. Manufacturers struggled to operate profitably while paying licensing fees. The Wright brothers believed they were protecting their rightful invention. From their perspective, they had solved the core problem of flight, and others were profiting from their work without permission. Yet, public opinion gradually turned against them. The situation became even more complicated as aviation gained military importance. By the early 1910s, airplanes were no longer curiosities. They were tools of war, reconnaissance, and national defense. Governments needed rapid technological progress, not legal paralysis. When World War I began in Europe in 1914, the contrast between European and American aviation became impossible to ignore. European nations had large fleets of aircraft and experienced pilots. The United States lagged far behind. Pressure mounted on the U.S. government to resolve the patent disputes. In 1917, the government intervened directly. It forced the creation of a patent pool, requiring all aviation manufacturers to share patents in exchange for standardized licensing fees. This move effectively ended the Wright brothers' control over American aviation patents. By this time, Wilbur Wright had already passed away in 1912, at the age of 45. Many believe that the stress of constant legal battles contributed to his declining health. Orville Wright lived until 1948, long enough to see aviation transform the world. The patent war had lasting consequences for their legacy. While the Wright brothers were legally recognized as the inventors of powered flight, their public image suffered. They were increasingly portrayed as obstacles rather than pioneers. Their insistence on enforcing patents overshadowed their technical brilliance in the eyes of many historians and engineers. Meanwhile, figures like Glenn Curtiss were celebrated for advancing aviation technology, despite having relied on concepts protected by Wright patents. Over time, narratives shifted. Some accounts minimized the Wright brothers' contributions, suggesting that flight was inevitable and that many inventors were equally responsible. This revision of history nearly erased the Wright brothers from their rightful place. Their story became a cautionary tale about the tension between innovation and intellectual property. How much protection is too much? When does defending an invention become a barrier to progress? These questions remain relevant today in industries ranging from software to biotechnology. The Wright brothers did not set out to slow aviation. They sought fairness and recognition. Yet, the legal framework of their time forced them into an adversarial role. The same system that protected their invention also isolated them. By the end of the First World War, aviation had moved beyond the Wrights' original designs. New materials, engines, and aerodynamic principles reshaped aircraft. However, the foundation of controlled flight remained unchanged. Every airplane still relied on three-axis control. The world had moved forward, but the brothers who made it possible stood quietly in the background, their names known but their struggle misunderstood. The final chapter of their story would redefine their legacy, not through lawsuits, but through history itself. By the time the patent wars ended and aviation entered the modern era, the Wright brothers were no longer at the center of the story they had begun. The airplane was evolving rapidly, driven by war, industrial investment, and global competition. New names, new machines, and new records captured public attention. Yet beneath every advancement, the fundamental principles established by Wilbur and Orville Wright remained unchanged. After the creation of the aviation patent pool in 1917, American aircraft production finally accelerated. Manufacturers were free to innovate without constant fear of litigation. Engines became more powerful. Airframes grew stronger. Speed, altitude, and range increased dramatically. Aviation became an industry rather than an experiment. This explosion of progress, however, came too late to benefit the Wright brothers personally. Wilbur Wright had died 5 years earlier, in 1912. He never saw airplanes used in large-scale warfare, commercial transport, or global travel. His death marked a turning point. Without Wilbur, Orville gradually stepped away from active aviation development. The intense partnership that defined their success could not be replicated. Orville Wright lived long enough to witness the transformation of aviation into a global system. He saw airplanes cross oceans, carry passengers, and shape geopolitics. He also saw his brother's role, and his own, increasingly questioned or minimized in popular narratives. As aviation history was written and rewritten, a subtle shift occurred. Some historians and commentators began portraying the invention of flight as an inevitable outcome rather than a specific achievement. They emphasized the contributions of multiple inventors across different countries, suggesting that the Wright brothers were merely one part of a larger movement. This interpretation, while partially true, often failed to acknowledge a critical fact. Many early aircraft flew briefly, unstably, or without full control. What separated the Wright brothers from others was not that they flew first, but that they solved the complete problem of flight. They achieved controlled, sustained, powered flight with repeatability and precision. Without three-axis control, aviation could not progress safely or reliably. Despite this, public memory is not shaped by technical definitions alone. It is shaped by stories, visibility, and cultural momentum. European aviators gained recognition through public demonstrations. Military pilots became heroes. Manufacturers became symbols of national power. The Wright brothers, who avoided publicity and fought legal battles behind closed doors, faded from the spotlight. In some accounts, their insistence on patent enforcement was framed as greed or obstruction. This narrative ignored the reality of their position. The brothers were not wealthy industrialists. They were independent inventors who invested years of unpaid labor into solving a problem that defeated everyone else. The patent system was the only mechanism available to protect their work. Their story mirrors a recurring pattern in technological history. Inventors who create foundational breakthroughs often struggle to control how those breakthroughs are used. As industries grow, original contributors are absorbed into larger narratives dominated by corporations, governments, and institutions. The Wright brothers became victims of their own success. In the decades following World War I, aviation history became increasingly simplified. Textbooks reduced complex developments into timelines and headlines. Nuance was lost. Legal battles were condensed into footnotes. The brothers' cautious, methodical approach was overshadowed by more dramatic stories of speed records and aerial combat. However, among engineers and aviation experts, respect for the Wright brothers never disappeared. Aviation professionals understood that modern aircraft still relied on the principles established in the early 1900s. Roll, pitch, and yaw remain the foundation of flight control. Whether achieved through wing warping, ailerons, or fly-by-wire systems, the concept was unchanged. In the mid-20th century, renewed academic interest began to restore balance to the historical record. Researchers revisited original documents, flight logs, patents, and eyewitness accounts. These studies confirmed what the Wright brothers had always claimed. They were the first to achieve controlled, powered, heavier-than-air flight. Museums and institutions gradually corrected earlier omissions. The Wright Flyer took its place as one of the most important machines in human history. Kitty Hawk became a symbol of innovation. Dayton, Ohio, reclaimed its role as the birthplace of aviation. Orville Wright, in his later years, actively defended the historical truth. He corresponded with historians, corrected inaccuracies, and clarified misconceptions. Though he rarely sought attention, he understood the importance of preserving the factual record. By the time of his death in 1948, the foundations of the modern aviation narrative were firmly established. Yet the phrase, almost erased, remains significant. Without legal documentation, physical evidence, and persistent historical review, the Wright brothers' contributions could have been diluted beyond recognition. Their story demonstrates how easily innovation can be absorbed into collective progress, leaving individual pioneers behind. This lesson extends far beyond aviation. In every major technological revolution, there are figures whose ideas define the future but whose names fade over time. Patent disputes, business conflicts, and political forces shape not only markets, but memory itself. The Wright brothers did not invent flight for fame. They pursued a problem that fascinated them intellectually and mechanically. Their success came from patience, observation, experimentation, and a willingness to question accepted knowledge. They failed repeatedly. They refined relentlessly. They trusted data over opinion. In an age before computers, simulations, or wind tunnels, they built their own tools. They measured forces by hand. They tested theories in sand and wind. Their method was scientific, disciplined, and profoundly modern. Modern aerospace engineering traces its roots directly to their approach. Every commercial flight, military aircraft, and spacebound vehicle carries the legacy of controlled flight. The systems may be digital now, but the logic remains the same. Balance, control, and feedback govern motion through the air. The Wright brothers gave humanity access to the skies, but their greatest contribution was not the airplane itself. It was the understanding of how to control motion in 3 dimensions. That insight reshaped warfare, commerce, culture, and perception. It connected continents. It altered the speed of history. Their story is not simply one of invention, but of recognition delayed and nearly denied. It reminds us that progress does not always honor its pioneers immediately. Sometimes, history must be revisited and corrected. The brothers who invented flight were not erased, but they came close. And remembering how close they came helps us better understand the hidden forces behind innovation, ownership, and legacy.